They said the old rancher had nothing left worth taking, but before the sun rose the next morning, hundreds of riders would prove them wrong. Before we go on, tell me something. Where are you watching from tonight? A quiet town in Texas, a ranch out in Montana, maybe somewhere far beyond the desert where this story began. Wherever you are, settle in for a moment and listen close, because out here in the Old West, a single act of kindness could echo farther than a gunshot. Elias Carter had lived on the edge of Dry Mesa Valley for nearly 40 years, though most folks in the nearest town barely remembered he was still alive. His ranch sat 12 miles beyond the last dirt road, where the prairie flattened into a wide stretch of red dust and wind-carved rock. The wooden fence around his land leaned like tired men after a long day, and the barn roof had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt stitched by the weather itself. At 70 years old, Elias moved slower than he once had, but he still rose before the sun, still saddled his horse without asking for help, and still watched the horizon every morning the way a man does when he's spent his life alone. People in town said Elias Carter had chosen that loneliness, but the truth was simpler than that. The land had outlasted everything else. His wife had passed nearly a decade earlier. The cattle herd had thinned down to a handful of stubborn animals, and the men he once rode with had either moved east or faded into stories told in saloons long after midnight. So Elias stayed. A man doesn't abandon land that knows his footsteps. That evening the wind rolled in from the south carrying the dry smell of sagebrush and distant rain. Elias had just finished stacking firewood beside the porch when he noticed something strange along the far side of the fence line. At first it was only movement, a dark shape against the fading orange sky. The sun was dipping behind the hills, stretching long shadows across the valley, and the quiet out there was so deep a man could hear his own heartbeat if he stood still long enough. Elias rested his hand on the porch rail and squinted toward the fence. Most travelers never came this far, out unless they were lost. The land beyond his ranch belonged mostly to silence. But the shape moved again, slow, uneven, like someone who had walked too many miles with too little strength left. He stepped off the porch and crossed the yard, boots pressing into the dusty earth. His old horse, Rusty, lifted its head from the trough and gave a low snort as if it sensed something unusual too. When Elias reached the fence line, he saw her. A young Apache girl leaned against the weathered wood, her hand gripping the post to keep herself standing. Dust covered her clothes, and the last light of day caught the faint tremble in her shoulders. She looked no older than 20, maybe younger, with dark hair tied loosely behind her neck and eyes that carried the kind of exhaustion a man only sees in travelers who have been running a long time. For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind pushed softly through the dry grass around them, whispering across the empty valley. Elias studied her carefully. Out here, strangers often carried trouble with them the way storms carried thunder. But something about the way she stood there, quiet and determined despite the long road behind her, reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not suspicion, just the simple understanding that sometimes a person arrives at your door because there is nowhere else left to go. The girl's voice finally broke the silence, soft but steady. They are hunting me. Elias Carter looked out across the empty prairie, where the horizon stretched for miles in every direction. The wind moved again, brushing the tall grass flat for a moment before letting it rise back up. He could have told her to keep walking, could have pointed her toward the river road or the canyon trail, and closed the gate behind her. That would have been the safe choice, the sensible choice. Instead, the old rancher reached out, pushed the creaking wooden gate open, and said quietly, "Then you'd better come inside before night falls." He didn't know her name yet, didn't know where she had come from or what danger might follow her across the valley. What Elias Carter didn't know was that by opening that gate, he had just changed the morning that was coming. Elias Carter closed the gate behind the girl, and the drywood creaked softly in the evening wind as if the land itself had noticed the decision he had just made. The sky over Dry Mesa Valley had turned the deep copper color that came only in the last minutes before nightfall, when the desert air cooled and the prairie seemed to hold its breath. The girl moved slowly beside him across the yard, each step careful and quiet, as though she had walked far beyond the strength she had left. Rusty lifted his head again from the trough and watched her with dark, patient eyes, the way old horses watch strangers who carried the smell of distant places. Elias opened the door to the small ranch house and stepped aside so she could enter first. The room inside was simple and worn from decades of use. A wooden table sat near the window. A cast iron stove rested in the corner beside a stack of split cedar logs. A single oil lamp hung above the table, casting a warm amber light across the rough plank floor. The girl paused just inside the doorway, as if the quiet surprised her. Out here, the silence inside a home felt different from the silence of the open prairie. It felt safe. Elias moved to the stove without speaking and struck a match. The small flame flared and caught the wick of the lamp, spreading a gentle glow through the room. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The wind brushed against the outside wall, and the distant creak of the barn drifted through the open window. Finally, Elias poured water from a tin kettle into a cup and placed it on the table in front of her. The girl wrapped both hands around it, not drinking at first, only feeling the warmth against her fingers as though she needed to remember what warmth felt like. Up close, Elias could see the long road in her eyes. Travelers carried that look when they had been moving day after day without rest. He had seen it once years ago in a young cowboy who had crossed 3 states chasing cattle through a winter storm. The girl studied the room slowly, her gaze touching each familiar object as if measuring the distance between danger and shelter. At last she spoke. "My name is Nayeli." Her voice was soft but steady, and it carried the rhythm of someone who had learned English carefully rather than growing up with it. Elias nodded once. "Elias Carter. This place has been mine longer than I can remember." She lowered her eyes to the cup again and drank a small sip. The water must have tasted better than anything she had found along the trail, because her shoulders relaxed just slightly. Elias sat down across from her at the table, folding his weathered hands together. The lamplight revealed the deep lines around his eyes and the silver threads in his beard, marks of a life that had been shaped by wind and sun and years of quiet work. "You said someone was hunting you." Nayeli looked toward the window where darkness had begun to gather outside the glass. Her expression did not show panic now, only a quiet certainty that the road behind her had not ended yet. "Some men came to our camp 3 days ago," she said. "They did not come as friends. They asked questions about things that do not belong to them." Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "My father told me to leave before the sun rose. He said I must carry something away from them." Elias leaned back slowly in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. The prairie beyond his land stretched empty for miles, but he knew better than most men that empty land could hide many things. "What did he ask you to carry?" Nayeli reached beneath the dust-worn edge of her coat and drew out a small leather pouch tied with a braided cord. She placed it gently on the table between them. The lamplight caught the beadwork stitched along its edge, patterns of deep red and turquoise that looked older than the ranch house itself. Elias did not touch it. He had lived long enough to know when an object carried more meaning than its size suggested. Nayeli spoke quietly. "My father said this must not fall into the wrong hands." Elias looked at the pouch for a long moment, then back toward the dark window where the last color of sunset had faded into night. The wind outside shifted again across the valley, and somewhere far out in the prairie a coyote called once before falling silent. Elias Carter had spent most of his life believing the world had forgotten his small corner of Dry Mesa Valley. Sitting there in the lamplight with the leather pouch resting between them, he began to realize that the quiet around his ranch might not remain quiet for very long. Night settled over Dry Mesa Valley with the slow patience of the desert, the kind of darkness that did not fall all at once but crept quietly across the land until every fence post and mesquite tree faded into shadow. Inside the ranch house, the oil lamp burned steadily above the table, its warm light reflecting off the small leather pouch resting between Elias Carter and the young Apache woman. The wind outside carried the dry scent of dust and sage, whispering along the wooden walls the way it had every night for decades. Yet tonight the sound seemed different, as though the valley itself were listening. Elias remained seated for a long moment, studying the pouch without touching it. The beadwork along the edge formed patterns he had seen only a few times before in his life, designs that belonged to Apache families who carried old traditions older than any town or ranch in the territory. Finally, he lifted his eyes toward Nayeli. "You said your father told you to carry that away from them." Nayeli nodded slowly. Her shoulders had begun to relax in the quiet of the room, but the alertness in her eyes had not faded. He said some men do not respect what is sacred. They look at land and see only what they can take from it. Elias leaned back slightly in his chair, listening to the wind outside shift direction again. In the desert, a man learned to read small changes. A different wind meant a coming storm. A new silence in the prairie often meant riders somewhere on the trail. He folded his weathered hands on the table. What is inside the pouch? Nayeli hesitated, then untied the braided cord and opened it carefully. She turned it just enough for the lamplight to reach inside. Resting within the leather was a necklace made of polished turquoise stones set in silver. The stones glowed softly in the lamplight like small pieces of the desert sky. Elias recognized the style immediately. That kind of necklace did not belong to ordinary traders or travelers. It belonged to leadership. It belonged to someone whose word carried weight among many people. Nayeli closed the pouch again and tied the cord. It is my father's symbol, she said quietly. He leads our people. If the wrong men take it, they will say he has lost his place. They will say our tribe is weak. Elias breathed slowly through his nose and glanced toward the dark window again. Somewhere far out in the valley, Rusty shifted his hooves against the ground near the barn, the faint sound drifting through the night air. Leadership symbols were powerful things in the frontier. In towns, they took the form of badges or documents. Among tribes, they were often carried in objects passed from generation to generation. Men had started wars over smaller things. How far behind you are these men? Nayeli lowered her voice. I do not know exactly. She looked toward the door as if the night itself might be listening. But they follow the trail of my horse. When she became too tired, I left her near the canyon spring and continued on foot. Elias nodded once. That explained the uneven steps he had seen along the fence line earlier. The girl had pushed herself farther than most grown men would manage. The old rancher stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the window. The glass reflected the lamplight faintly, but beyond it the prairie stretched dark and silent under a sky filled with stars. He had watched that horizon nearly every evening for 40 years, and he knew the rhythm of the land. Nothing moved out there now. Yet a strange feeling settled in his chest, the quiet instinct of a man who had spent too long surviving the frontier to ignore what his senses told him. Behind him, Nayeli remained seated at the table, both hands resting near the pouch as if guarding it even in a moment of calm. After a few seconds, Elias spoke again, without turning around. If they reach this valley by night, they will not see much. The land hides many things after dark. He paused, then looked back toward her. But by morning the trail will be easier to follow. Nayeli met his gaze across the lamplit room. My father said the same thing. Elias Carter walked back toward the table and lifted the kettle from the stove, pouring fresh water into her cup. The simple act felt almost ordinary, yet the quiet weight of the evening had begun to settle deeper in the room. Outside, the wind eased for a moment, and the valley fell completely silent. Elias had lived alone long enough to recognize the meaning of that silence. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the road behind Nayeli was still moving forward, and before another sunrise reached Dry Mesa Valley, the quiet around his ranch might no longer belong only to him. The silence outside the ranch house did not last long. Elias Carter had learned through many years on the frontier that the desert never stayed quiet without reason. Sometimes the land held its breath before a storm. Sometimes before travelers arrived on the long trail that cut through Dry Mesa Valley. He stepped onto the porch and pulled the door closed gently behind him so the warm lamplight inside would not spill too far into the night. The sky stretched wide above the valley, filled with thousands of sharp stars that shone brighter out here than anywhere near a town. Elias rested one hand on the wooden railing and looked across the open prairie. From the porch, he could see nearly 2 miles in every direction before the land dipped toward the distant canyon ridges. Nothing moved. The grass bent slowly in the wind. The barn stood quiet beside the well. Rusty shifted his weight near the fence and flicked his tail against the night air. Yet something about the darkness felt heavier than usual, as if the land itself carried a question waiting to be answered. After a moment, Elias stepped down from the porch and walked across the yard toward the barn. His boots pressed softly into the dry soil, and the faint crunch of gravel echoed in the stillness. Inside the barn, he lifted a lantern from its hook and checked the stall doors one by one. It was an old habit, the kind that stayed with a man long after he no longer kept a full herd of cattle. When he finished, he leaned against the wooden beam beside Rusty and listened again. The horse raised its head slowly and stared toward the southern ridgeline. Elias followed the animal's gaze, but saw nothing except a dark stretch of horizon. Animals often sensed distant movement long before people did. That was another lesson the frontier taught early. Elias reached up and rubbed the horse's neck once before turning back toward the house. When he stepped inside again, the room smelled faintly of cedar smoke from the stove. Nayeli remained at the table with the small leather pouch resting beside her hands. She had removed the dust-worn coat and folded it neatly over the chair, revealing the simple woven fabric of her dress beneath. The lamplight softened the sharp lines of exhaustion on her face, but it did not erase them completely. Elias set the lantern near the door and poured more water into the kettle on the stove. "You should rest while you can," he said quietly. "The road you walked today was longer than most people could manage." Nayeli looked toward the window again. "Do you believe they will come here?" Elias considered the question for a moment before answering. "Men who chase something valuable do not stop easily. If they followed you this far, they will likely follow until the trail ends." She lowered her gaze to the pouch once more. "My father said some men believe the desert belongs only to them." Elias gave a faint smile that carried more years than humor. "Many men believe that about many things." He placed a small plate of bread and dried meat on the table. "Eat something. Your body needs strength more than worry tonight." Nayeli took a small piece and ate slowly, as if remembering how hunger felt after the long miles behind her. The quiet returned to the room again, broken only by the soft crackle of the stove and the distant whisper of wind across the valley. Elias sat down across from her and watched the flame of the oil lamp sway gently. The ranch house had seen many nights like this one, though none quite the same. After a while, Nayeli spoke again. "If they find this place, I do not want trouble to follow you." Elias lifted his eyes to meet hers and shook his head once. "Trouble has passed through this valley before. The land remembers worse things than travelers." He leaned back slightly and folded his arms. "Besides, an old rancher does not get many visitors anymore. Tonight the house feels less empty than it has in years." Nayeli studied him quietly, perhaps realizing that behind the calm voice sat a man who had made his decision the moment he opened the gate. Outside, the wind rose again, brushing across the dry grass and rattling the loose board along the barn wall. Elias glanced toward the door once more. He had the strange feeling that the valley was slowly changing shape around his small ranch, like a story turning its page. Somewhere far beyond the dark ridges, a trail still moved closer through the night. And before morning arrived at Dry Mesa Valley, that trail would bring answers that neither of them had yet imagined. The night stretched deeper over Dry Mesa Valley, and for several quiet hours the ranch seemed to settle into the familiar rhythm Elias Carter had known for decades. The oil lamp burned low on the table, the stove gave off a steady warmth, and the wind outside moved softly across the prairie grass like a slow-breathing tide. Elias had pulled an extra blanket from the small chest near the wall and placed it over the back of a chair for Nayeli, but she had not yet tried to sleep. Instead, she sat quietly with the leather pouch resting beside her, watching the flame of the lamp as though listening to the long road still echoing in her thoughts. Elias stood near the window again, his posture relaxed but his eyes steady on the dark horizon. Out here, a man learned that trouble did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived the same way dawn did, slowly at first, then all at once. The valley remained still for a long time, long enough that even Rusty had settled near the barn and the coyotes had stopped calling from the distant hills. Then Elias heard it. At first it was nothing more than a faint tremor carried through the ground beneath the house floor. A distant rhythm, too steady to be wind, too measured to be thunder. Elias stepped closer to the window and lifted the lantern slightly to dim the reflection in the glass. The sound came again, clearer now. Hoofbeats. Far away, but moving steadily toward the valley. Nayeli looked up from the table the moment she saw the change in his expression. Her voice was calm but quiet. "They have found the trail." Elias nodded slowly. It sounded like more than one horse, but not a large group. 2 or 3 riders perhaps. He set the lantern down and moved toward the door, pausing only long enough to take his hat from the peg. Near the wall. "Stay inside for now," he said. "The night hides many things, but it also hides you." Nayeli did not argue. She only placed her hand lightly over the pouch as if reassuring herself it was still there. Elias stepped onto the porch and closed the door gently behind him. The cool desert air carried the sound more clearly now. Hoofbeats approaching from the south ridge, still more than a mile away, but drawing closer with every passing minute. Elias rested both hands on the porch railing and watched the darkness carefully. A man who had spent 40 years on open land could judge distance by sound alone. These riders were not wandering travelers. They were following a direction with purpose. The faint glow of the ranch house lantern must have been visible from the trail, because within a few minutes the hoofbeats slowed and shifted course slightly toward the property fence. Elias could just make out 3 figures moving across the open prairie, their shapes rising and falling with the motion of their horses. The riders approached without hurry, but without hesitation either. When they reached the fence line, one of them raised a hand in greeting rather than reaching for anything threatening. "Evening, old-timer," the man called across the yard in a steady voice. His accent carried the tone of someone who had spent many years riding between towns and trading posts. Elias remained on the porch and answered calmly, "Evening to you as well." The rider glanced briefly toward the barn and the well, taking in the quiet details of the ranch the way experienced travelers always did. "We are looking for someone who passed through this valley tonight. A young woman traveling alone." Elias rested one elbow against the railing and looked out across the dark prairie as though considering the question carefully. "Travelers sometimes pass this valley," he said. "It is a long road between water sources." The rider studied him for a moment in silence, the lantern light faintly illuminating the brim of Elias Carter's hat. "If she came this way, we would appreciate knowing it. The desert can be dangerous after dark." Elias gave a small nod, his voice steady and unhurried. "If I see anyone on the road, I will tell them riders are searching the valley tonight." The 3 men exchanged brief glances with each other. They did not push the conversation further. After a moment, the rider tipped his hat politely. "Much obliged, sir." The group turned their horses slowly and continued east along the fence line before disappearing once more into the wide darkness of the prairie. Elias remained standing on the porch long after the sound of hoofbeats faded into the wind. He knew men like that rarely abandoned a search after one quiet conversation. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, they would circle back and follow the trail again when daylight returned. Inside the ranch house, the oil lamp still glowed softly over the table where Nayeli waited in silence. Elias Carter turned slowly toward the door, already understanding that the quiet night he once knew had begun to change, and by the time the sun rose over Dry Mesa Valley, the road behind those riders would not be empty. For a long time after the riders disappeared into the dark, Elias Carter remained on the porch without moving. The wind drifted slowly across Dry Mesa Valley again, brushing the tall grass and carrying the faint smell of dry earth and distant sage. The hoofbeats had faded completely now, but the quiet that followed felt different from the peaceful silence earlier that evening. This silence carried weight, like the pause between thunder and the coming storm. Elias rested both hands on the railing and stared toward the eastern ridge where the riders had vanished. He had seen men like them before during the long years of frontier life. Not bandits exactly, not lawmen either. The kind of men who followed opportunity wherever it led, especially when something valuable lay at the end of the trail. After several minutes, he turned and stepped back inside the ranch house. The door closed softly behind him, and the warm glow of the oil lamp wrapped around the room again. Nayeli looked up the moment he entered. Her eyes searched his face, not with panic, but with the calm awareness of someone who already understood what the night was bringing. Elias removed his hat slowly and set it on the wooden peg by the door. 3 riders, he said quietly. They asked about a young woman traveling through the valley. Nayeli lowered her gaze to the table for a moment and then nodded once. They will not stop. Elias walked to the stove and added another small log to the fire. The cedar wood caught quickly, sending a thin ribbon of smoke up through the iron vent pipe. Out here a man learned that worry did not solve anything. Preparation did. He poured water from the kettle into 2 cups and placed one in front of her. "You should try to sleep for a few hours," he said. "Morning comes fast in this valley." Nayeli wrapped her hands around the cup again, but did not drink. "My father said the desert has many eyes. If those men ride back when the sun rises, they will see my footprints near your fence." Elias nodded slowly. That was true. The hard ground of the prairie held tracks longer than most travelers realized. By daylight, the trail would be easier to follow. He sat down across from her again and studied the small leather pouch resting beside her hand. Symbols like that necklace carried meaning far beyond the silver and stone. They carried responsibility. "What will your father do when he learns you left the camp with it?" Elias asked. Naeli looked up, and for the first time a faint spark of confidence appeared in her tired expression. "He will follow the trail as well." Elias raised an eyebrow slightly. "With many riders." The wind outside shifted again and rattled the loose barn board in the distance. Elias leaned back in his chair, absorbing that quiet statement. In the frontier there were moments when a man suddenly realized the story around him had grown larger than his small ranch or his quiet life. This felt like one of those moments. After a long pause he spoke again. "Then we have until sunrise to decide how this morning will look." Naeli studied him with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Elias gestured gently toward the window where the stars still burned bright above the prairie. "If those riders return first they will expect answers. But if someone else reaches this valley before them the story may unfold differently." Naeli understood the meaning behind his words. The desert wind moved again across the valley and the ranch house settled into another deep stretch of silence. Eventually Elias rose from the table and laid the extra blanket across the small couch near the stove. "You should rest now," he said softly. "The land will look very different when the sun rises." Naeli stood slowly, still holding the leather pouch close to her chest. Before she lay down, she looked once more toward the window where the dark prairie stretched beyond the fence line. Somewhere far out there, two trails were moving through the same desert night. One trail carried 3 riders searching quietly across the valley. The other carried many more who had not yet reached the horizon. And when those trails finally met at the edge of Elias Carter's ranch, the morning that followed would not belong to silence anymore. The desert night slowly gave way to the pale gray hush that comes just before sunrise, the quiet hour when the land feels suspended between darkness and day. Elias Carter had slept only lightly in the wooden chair near the stove, the way old ranchers often did after years of listening to wind and cattle through long nights. When his eyes opened, the oil lamp had nearly burned out, and the first faint line of morning light touched the far edge of the window glass. Outside, Dry Mesa Valley lay still beneath a thin veil of dawn mist. Elias stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders, and walked to the door. When he stepped onto the porch, the cool morning air carried the smell of dust and distant stone, the familiar scent of the desert waking. Rusty was already awake near the barn, his ears turned toward the southern horizon. Horses noticed the morning earlier than men. Elias rested one hand against the porch post and looked across the wide prairie. At first, everything appeared calm. The fence line stretched quietly toward the east. The windmill stood motionless above the well. Even the grass barely stirred. But then he noticed it. Far beyond the southern ridge, nearly 2 miles away, a faint movement began to rise against the pale sky. It was not a single rider. Not even 3. It was something larger. The distant line of the horizon shimmered with motion, like heat rising from the ground even though the sun had not yet appeared. Elias narrowed his eyes and leaned slightly forward. Within a few moments the shape became clearer. Dozens of figures on horseback were moving across the valley floor, their silhouettes steady and organized, riding together in a long sweeping line that stretched wider than the dry creek bed below the ridge. The earth beneath the porch boards began to carry a soft vibration as the sound of many hooves rolled across the distance like distant thunder. Elias did not feel fear. Instead, a strange calm settled over him. The calm that comes when a man realizes a moment he has waited for has finally arrived. Behind him, the ranch house door opened quietly, and Naeli stepped onto the porch. She had already wrapped the leather pouch carefully beneath her coat, and her dark hair moved slightly in the morning breeze. She followed Elias's gaze toward the horizon, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The first rays of sunlight touched the ridge then, spilling gold across the desert and illuminating the riders below. The figures were now clearly visible. Many horses, many men. Their line moved with quiet discipline, not rushing but advancing with the steady confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. Naeli's voice was soft when she finally spoke. "They have come." Elias nodded once. "Your father rides with them." Naeli did not answer immediately, but the faint relief in her eyes confirmed what he had already guessed. The riders continued forward until they reached the low rise nearly half a mile from the ranch. There they slowed and spread slightly across the prairie, their presence filling the valley with a quiet strength that felt larger than the land itself. Dust drifted behind the horses in long ribbons of sunlight. From the porch, Elias could now see the details clearly. Feathered ornaments, beaded sashes, riders carrying themselves with the calm posture of experienced warriors. The group numbered far more than a few dozen. It looked closer to 100, perhaps more. Naeli stepped forward beside Elias and rested her hands lightly on the porch railing. Her voice carried a note of quiet respect. My father does not travel with small numbers when the honor of our people is at stake. Elias gave a faint nod as he studied the scene unfolding across his quiet valley. For 40 years, Dry Mesa Ranch had stood alone in this wide desert, visited only by cattle traders, wandering travelers, and the occasional curious rider passing through the territory. Never had the land witnessed something like this. The riders halted in a broad semicircle facing the ranch gate. They did not shout or rush forward. They simply waited. The silence that followed felt even deeper than the stillness of the night before. Elias Carter adjusted the brim of his hat and looked down the path that led from the porch to the wooden gate. The desert wind moved gently through the grass again, as if acknowledging the moment. Whatever happened next would decide the story that the valley would remember for years to come. The riders waited in complete silence across the open prairie, their horses standing still beneath the rising morning sun as the wide valley filled with pale golden light. From the porch, Elias Carter could see them clearly now. The line stretched across the gentle slope nearly half a mile away, forming a quiet wall of riders facing the ranch gate. None of them shouted. None raised a weapon or signaled forward. They simply remained there, calm and watchful, as though the land itself had gathered to witness what would happen next. Elias rested both hands on the porch railing and studied the group carefully. The man at the center of the line sat slightly ahead of the others, his posture straight, his presence commanding without effort. Even at that distance, it was clear he carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being followed. Naeli stepped forward beside Elias, and her eyes softened with recognition. That is my father, she said quietly. Elias nodded slowly. The man guided his horse a few steps forward and then stopped again, leaving a wide, open stretch of prairie between the riders and the ranch fence. It was not a threat. It was respect. After a moment, Naeli reached beneath her coat and removed the leather pouch. She untied the cord and drew out the turquoise necklace, the silver catching the early sunlight so that the stones glowed with a deep desert blue. Elias watched the necklace for a moment before glancing back toward the distant riders. Symbols like that carried weight among people who respected tradition. Naeli closed her fingers around the necklace gently and stepped down from the porch. Elias moved beside her as they walked slowly across the yard toward the wooden gate. The grass brushed softly around their boots, and the morning air remained cool and still. When they reached the gate, Naeli paused and looked toward her father again. The riders behind him had not moved at all. Their patience filled the valley with a quiet dignity that felt almost sacred. Naeli lifted the necklace slightly so the sunlight touched it again. The man at the front of the riders noticed immediately. He raised one hand slowly, and behind him the entire line of horsemen remained motionless. Then he guided his horse forward alone, crossing the open ground between the ridge and the ranch. His approach was calm and steady. When he reached the fence, he stopped several yards away and removed the feathered band from his hair, holding it respectfully against his chest. Naeli stepped forward and opened the gate. The hinges creaked softly in the morning quiet. "Father," she said gently. The man looked at her for a long moment before speaking, his voice deep and steady like wind across the canyon walls. "You carried it safely." Naeli held out the necklace, and he accepted it with careful hands, lifting the turquoise stones briefly toward the rising sun before placing it around his neck. Then he turned his gaze toward Elias Carter. For a moment, the two men studied each other across the short stretch of ground between them. Elias stood calmly with one hand resting on the wooden gate, his weathered face calm beneath the brim of his hat. Finally, the Apache leader spoke. "My daughter told me who gave her shelter when the night was long." Elias shrugged slightly, as though the matter were simple. A traveler needed a roof and a little warmth. "That is all." The man nodded once, the expression in his eyes thoughtful. "Kindness is never a small thing, he said quietly, especially in a land where many have forgotten it. Behind him, the line of riders began to move slowly forward until they reached the ridge beside their leader. They stopped again without crossing the ranch boundary, their presence powerful but peaceful. The leader turned once more toward Elias and spoke clearly so that the valley itself seemed to hear the words. This land will not be troubled while our people ride these valleys. Elias Carter gave a small nod and rested his arm across the gate again. The wind moved softly through the grass as the morning sun rose higher over Dry Mesa Valley, and the old rancher realized that the quiet life he had known for so many years had just been touched by something far greater than he had ever expected. The morning sun climbed slowly above the eastern ridge and spread warm light across Dry Mesa Valley, turning the dry grass pale gold and the distant rocks the color of old copper. The line of Apache riders remained still beyond the ranch fence, their horses quiet beneath them as the wind moved gently across the open land. Elias Carter stood beside the wooden gate with one arm resting on the weathered rail, watching the moment unfold with the steady calm of a man who had lived long enough to understand when something important was happening. The Apache leader finished placing the turquoise necklace around his neck and looked once more toward Nayeli, his expression softening with quiet pride before he turned back to the old rancher. For a moment, the valley felt suspended between two worlds, one belonging to the quiet life Elias had known for decades, and the other carried in the presence of the riders waiting across the prairie. The leader raised his hand slowly, and behind him the long line of warriors shifted forward a few steps before stopping again, forming a wide semicircle facing the ranch gate. Their movement was not threatening. It felt ceremonial, almost like a gathering beneath the open sky. The Apache leader spoke again, his voice carrying across the still air. Many men would have closed their doors to my daughter in the dark. Many would have feared the trouble that might follow her steps. Elias glanced briefly toward Nayeli standing beside him and then back toward the riders. Trouble has a way of finding its own road, he said quietly. The least a man can do is offer a little shelter when it arrives. The leader studied him with a thoughtful expression and then nodded once. Among our people we remember such things. He turned slightly in the saddle and spoke a few words in his native language. The riders behind him responded at once. One by one they dismounted from their horses and stepped forward until they stood in a long line along the fence beyond the gate. Then something unexpected happened. Each warrior lowered his head briefly toward the old rancher standing at the entrance to the property. The gesture was simple and silent, but the meaning behind it carried more respect than any loud declaration could have offered. Elias Carter felt the weight of the moment settle across his quiet ranch like the morning sun itself. He had spent most of his life believing the world had forgotten this small corner of the desert. Yet here stood more than 100 riders honoring a simple decision made during a lonely night. Nayeli stepped closer to the gate and looked toward her father again. The leader gave her a gentle nod, and she returned it with quiet understanding. After a few moments, the Apache leader turned his horse slightly toward the open valley. Before leaving, he looked once more at Elias Carter. The trails that cross this land will remember your kindness, he said. As long as our people ride these valleys, no harm will come to this ranch or to the man who gave shelter when it was needed. Elias did not answer with grand words. He simply tipped his hat in the old habit of frontier courtesy. The leader returned the gesture before guiding his horse slowly away from the gate. The riders behind him mounted again and began moving across the prairie in the same quiet order in which they had arrived. Dust rose softly beneath the hooves as the long line of horses stretched across the sunlit valley and gradually faded toward the distant canyon ridges. Within minutes, the riders were little more than moving shadows against the horizon. Eventually, even those shadows disappeared into the wide, open desert. The wind returned to the valley then, rustling through the grass and brushing gently against the fence posts that had stood beside Elias Carter's ranch for nearly 40 years. He remained at the gate for a long moment, watching the empty prairie where the riders had been. Beside him, Nayeli followed the disappearing trail with calm eyes before turning back toward the house. The ranch looked the same as it had the day before. The barn still leaned slightly toward the well. Rusty still waited beside the fence. The quiet desert still stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Yet something had changed in the story of this lonely place. Elias Carter closed the wooden gate slowly and rested his hand against the old rail for a moment before walking back toward the porch. Out here in the wide lands of the American frontier, justice did not always arrive with noise or gunfire. Sometimes it arrived quietly, carried in the memory of a simple kindness that traveled farther than any man could ride.